This is Talk to the Left, and I'm your host, Jason Rigden. On this episode of the show, I'm here with Ethan Goodman of Tech for Housing. How are you today?
Just fine, thanks.
So could you tell me a little bit about the problems that Tech for Housing is trying to help with?
Sure. So we are trying to build a tech boom that benefits every resident. And what I mean by that is, we've seen tech booms in the Bay Area, in Seattle, and other cities, and you sort of see a large segment of the population being kind of left behind. I think if you ask 10 people in Seattle how they feel about Amazon booming, certainly you'll find a lot of people who are very happy about that. But you'll find some segments of the population that really feel that they haven't benefited at all and that they're being made worse off. And that's primarily because of the housing crisis. That's the main vector by which a booming tech economy is actually, in some cases, hurting people. And so what we set out to do is to say, how can we have a booming, prosperous tech industry that's really equitable, that's causing the region to grow in a way that really lifts all boats, and work towards a future where, everyone or almost everyone would say, gee, it's so fortunate for us that we have a thriving tech sector. That's really helped us to address the problems in our society.
Yeah, the city has changed quite a bit over the years with the booming economy. It never was I suppose in the 80s it was a cheap city to live in, but since I've been living here, it's not been a cheap city.
Yep. But it's become a much more expensive city even in the last 5 years. And one other thing I like to point out, because I grew up in the Bay Area, is we sort of have a notion, especially if you're from Seattle, that we've sort of reached the height of how crazy things can get. And let me tell you, from the Bay Area perspective, it could get so much worse still. Housing is almost twice as expensive in the Bay Area as it is here. So that's just a motivator to say, don't feel like we've hit rock bottom. We still need to really, really work, because it could get a lot worse still.
Yeah, it's good advice, but it's sad that it can always get worse. So how is Tech for Housing helping to solve these problems?
Yeah, so we were formed really to do political organizing and policy advocacy primarily. And so our take on these issues is that one of the most critical places where we need to do work in order to solve the housing crisis is in the policy arena. That really fundamentally we have a housing crisis, we have rising homelessness, we have, in Seattle, I think it's 50,000 households are severely rent burdened. That's people who pay more than half of their income towards housing costs. Our last one-night count of people who are homeless said there were over 12,000 people homeless in King County. So really serious problems. And we think those fundamentally come from really broken systems around housing and really broken public policies around housing. And so we're trying to address that sort of systems level change, policy level change, to really kind of readjust a lot of what we think about how housing operates. And we're trying to do that by getting individual tech workers, by getting tech companies themselves, by getting the whole tech sector to become a voice in support of housing reform. So I think the tech community has, to a large extent, at least up until the last year especially, been pretty absent from these discussions. The tech community has been sort of received a lot of the blame, somewhat justifiably, for rising housing prices. They've been a boogeyman, but they haven't really been terribly constructively involved in the conversation about solutions. And so we're saying, we need real policy change, and the way tech can really help is by lending its voice in support of that policy change, by helping to get the political will together to really move forward on these issues. And so that, going a step further, really comes back to then organizing, community organizing work, identifying champions who support housing, building a sense of community amongst people who care about housing in the tech world, and then making your voices heard, showing up at public hearings, writing letters to elected officials, carrying the conversation forward in the media, all of those sorts of more traditional advocacy and organizing things, but in a sector, technology, that hasn't traditionally been terribly actively engaged on local issues.
Yeah, a lot of tech workers came here because the quality of life in the community. And if we end up starting building like a monoculture here, it's not going to be nearly as desirable.
No. And one thing I tell sort of industry leaders when I get the chance is it's also really has a bearing on our competitiveness as an industry. That right now, and for the last several years, so many big tech companies are opening up offices in Seattle, hiring thousands of workers. And one of the biggest reasons they're doing that is that they can hire people and those people can afford to live here. And that's in sharp contrast to the Bay Area. The Bay Area has vastly more talent, vastly more potential employees that firms could hire. The Bay Area has vastly more venture capital and financing for companies. The one thing the Bay Area doesn't have is anywhere for any of those people to live. And I think if we kind of sit back and do nothing and let the housing crisis escalate, of course, the primary people who will be harmed by that are low-income people and vulnerable populations. But the tech industry itself is also going to be harmed by that because, why locate in Seattle if it's just as expensive as San Francisco? We sort of lose our competitive advantage at that point.
And there's a wide range of incomes for people working in tech. Not everyone working in tech is, making a ton of money.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who are directly employed by tech companies make a lot of money. The average salaries as a full-time employee of a company are very high. But there's a huge ecosystem of other jobs around the tech industry that really span the range of incomes and occupations. And, a lot of the people that I do organizing work with are software engineers, like you might expect. But plenty of them are in marketing, they're in business, they're in HR, they're in communications. So, the tech world is quite a bit bigger than just the software development world.
So you talked about people being rent burdened, but what's the definition right now of affordable housing?
Yeah, so this is something that kind of trips people up sometimes when they're new to working on these issues, because there's a lot of jargon. Like in any policy issue, there's a lot of jargon. What policy people mean when you're talking to an elected official or somebody talking about a particular proposal, affordable housing is really a term of art within the industry, and it means rentals that cost less than 30% of a household's total income. So if you make $100,000 a year, affordable housing for you is something that costs less than $30,000 a year for housing. And so when we talk about programs that build affordable housing, what we mean is for some specific income range, people making $30,000 to $40,000 a year, can we provide them with housing that costs less than 30% of that income level? And then we try and target all different income levels. So there's some housing that's targeted primarily at people making $0 to maybe $20,000 a year, and then there's different housing targeted at people making $40,000 to $60,000 a year. And so there's kind of levels of affordable housing all up and down the spectrum. But the thing that kind of holds it all together as affordable housing is that rents are held to a standard where a certain income level can afford those rents.
Do you think Seattle's making any progress towards affordability?
Yes and no. We're making a little bit of progress in terms of sort of slowing the increase. So prices aren't rising as fast as they were before, and we are building more affordable housing, that rent and income restricted housing, than we did before. But the question is it all happening fast enough to really be satisfied with the pace of change? And I definitely don't think it's fast enough for us to be able to step back and pat ourselves on the back. So there's really two things, two kind of sides, at least, to the affordable housing crisis. There's the affordable housing that's rent and income restricted and receives subsidy to achieve those targets. And then there's also just the market rate housing of, if you just go on Craigslist and look for apartments, what does an average apartment cost? And both of those are really important. You need to have a lot more subsidized affordable housing being built because the need is just dramatic. I mentioned there's about 50,000 households today paying more than half their rent on housing, 12,000 people homeless. So you can imagine that, we could do, if tomorrow we could have 50,000 more affordable homes, that would be wonderful. we're nowhere near producing tens of thousands of homes. But then there's also the market rate of housing. So there's just, for somebody who's not going to live in subsidized housing, who's just going to find housing on the open market, it really, really matters if rents go up 2% this year versus 8% this year, especially compounding year on year. So policy change has to address both of those, and we do work on kind of both sides of that coin. So how do we keep rental prices from going up year after year, and how do we massively expand our stock of affordable housing?
What have been some of the biggest challenges of developing this organization?
Well, there's a few things. So from an organizational development standpoint, the tech industry is historically not terribly involved in policy making or in politics. And I think there's, to some extent, sort of a cultural notion within the tech industry that politics is dirty or slow or inefficient. And all of that may be true, but politics is how you do collective decision making. And I don't think, as the tech industry matures, and let me say, tech has existed as an industry for many decades, and Silicon Valley was booming 40 years ago. But tech as an industry in cities is pretty new. We've only had Amazon here in the last decade. Down in San Francisco, they only had Twitter and other big companies move right downtown in the last decade. So I think the tech sector is still very immature in terms of what it means to be in a city and to be a city-based industry. And one of the things I think tech has to do as it matures is to realize that it has to take part in policy making. It has to take part in sort of public decisions about how a city is run. And it needs to sort of find its moral compass on what it's going to put its political weight behind. I don't think it's really, as an industry, sort of coalesced around what would it mean to be pro-housing. So that's one of the things we're trying to do, is to say, you really do need to be involved. This is super important. And as an industry, tech could be very, very powerful on the political front. That's sort of a warning and an optimistic statement. A warning in that I think if we don't try and organize the tech industry and get it to a point of really having a proper understanding of issues around housing, it could be very destructive to these policy discussions. So we first of all need to keep tech from doing harm. And then we also need to convince it that it also has a real opportunity to do good, that just a little bit of organizing, a little bit of exercising some political will in support of good causes could really kind of help get a lot of really good policy across the finish line. So that's some of the challenges on the organizing side, convincing people that they can take action, they should take action, that there's useful and good things for them to do. And then there's all the fights on the policy side of things. So how do you actually get legislation passed? And that's, for anybody who's ever worked in any policy area, it's always challenging. Democracies are slow moving and difficult, and there are a lot of interests pushing in a lot of different ways. And so we sort of have to triangulate a little as we try and push for policy change between one camp that sort of says, Seattle used to be wonderful and now it's being ruined. What we need to do is just not let anything change anymore from this point on. And that's sort of a whole camp of opposing any attempt to do anything. And then there's another camp that comes kind of further from the left that says, yeah, but anything that has to do with markets or private development is just inherently evil. And we don't want to deal with any of that. We sort of want to keep our hands perfectly clean. And so that's a challenge because, we do live in a market economy. The vast, vast majority of housing is privately built. And if we sort of just ignore that sector, then we're not getting at the root of the problem. So there's sort of competing interests on all sides. But we're trying to sort of thread that needle and say, look, there are incremental changes we can make that'll make our neighborhoods better, that'll make our neighborhoods more livable, that'll give more housing options so a wider variety of people can live in different neighborhoods, and that'll support affordable housing and actually increase the rate at which we're building subsidized rent restricted housing.
And have any of the large tech companies in this area, have they started working with you, or are you mostly just doing with individuals?
So for the last couple of years, we've been focused on grassroots advocacy. And the reason for that, this was a very particular choice, was seeing how kind of local policymaking and local advocacy is done, and seeing how much decision-making happens at a council hearing on a Tuesday morning at 10:30 a.m., and how 5 angry people showing up consistently really managed to change the policy conversation. So somewhat to my surprise, I've been doing local policy work for about 5 years. It's not necessarily the case that, big money is flooding millions of dollars into things. It's that concerned citizens are making themselves heard loudly and consistently. And if you don't show up to those sorts of debates, the other side wins. So if you have a situation where, take right now, there's been a several year long fight over backyard cottages and things like mother-in-law units. So can you convert your basement into a legal housing unit instead of maybe illegally renting out your basement? And very sensible change, but people who oppose that policy are very vocal and very persistent. And if they're the only ones who show up, it's very hard to get policy through. So all that is to say that we've been focusing on grassroots with the idea that just getting a handful of people, 2, 3, 4 people, to go up to a microphone and say, we work in the tech industry, we love the city, we want to support pro-housing policy, we think you should pass this bill, makes a big difference, especially because tech isn't showing up or hasn't been showing up much prior to that. So a lot of times, when we go up to a microphone or when we write letters to elected officials, it's the first they've heard from the tech industry. And so that carries a lot of weight that, they hear that message that tech supports housing. And that's a powerful message. In addition to that, though, things are going to change a little bit moving forward. So we had the whole head tax fight last year, which we could, dissect for the rest of this morning. One of the things, though, that I think is inarguable about that fight is that the organized political power of tech leadership, of the CEOs, of the finance people, was really powerful. That they had, by sort of having a unified voice and coming together in opposition to the head tax, that was a very powerful political statement. And so we're not going to be able to ignore the leadership sector and get good policy through. So going forward, we're going to focus efforts as well on, can we put together a contingent, maybe not a majority, but can we put together a vocal contingent of tech leadership that really wants proactive measures supporting housing, that really wants to dramatically increase our public investment in affordable housing, that really wants to put political will behind land use reform and changes to how our housing market works, and sort of get that leadership sector of the industry organized as well.
As you said, many people blame tech workers for the affordable housing crisis. How do you deal with that kind of hostility when oftentimes your goals are aligned?
Yeah, well, to anybody who's angry, I don't think tech needs to, or I don't think tech is going to have much luck convincing them not to be angry. This organization isn't about sort of justifying tech's presence to people who don't like tech's presence in their industry. It's about constructive policy change. And so I talk mostly to the people in tech who are hearing complaints that they're, having a negative impact on the city and the people in it. And I don't try and say that's wrong. I try and say, okay, well, what can we do about that then? How can we channel some of that? And if you feel guilty or responsible, that's great. We are a big part of this system that is clearly not working well for a whole lot of people. And so what we need to do, I try and tell tech people, is we need to change the system. It's obviously, not the case that tech people are just going to pack up and leave. And we don't want to advocate for less prosperity. That doesn't make terribly much sense. What we want to argue for is a system that makes good use of the prosperity it has, that can harness the massive amount of resources that have been brought to the city and put those really in service of everybody in the region and especially of the most vulnerable. And so that's what I say to people when they're sort of saying, "Oh, but isn't tech just part of the problem?" I'd say, it's sort of one cog in that system, but we can really help change that system together.
So what plans do you have for the future for your organization?
Well, one thing I already mentioned, which is to talk a lot more to tech leadership and to executives and CEOs and such, and really try and pull together a coalition of people who are willing to support kind of bolder, more constructive reform. The other is to expand outside of Seattle a bit. So we've been really Seattle focused for the last couple of years, and we'll maintain a lot of focus on Seattle. But there's a whole lot of work happening at the county level, and there's a whole lot of work happening at the state level. And so we want over the future to really have a much bigger presence in Olympia. The dollar amounts they deal with at the state level, just there's a few more zeros on the end of everything at the state level than there is at the city level. So when you talk about how can we get $100 million for affordable housing, that's easier to talk about at the state level than at the city level. And then at the county level as well, there's been a lot of people talking about the need for regional solutions. And so that's primarily at the county level. So we're going to be doing more work there. And also on the east side, there's a huge portion of the tech industry is on the east side in Redmond and Bellevue and Kirkland. And we haven't had much presence there before, but we're going to try and do some organizing work over on the east side as well.
Well, Tech for Housing is a much needed organization. Is there anything I should have asked you that maybe I missed?
We can tell people how to find out more and how to follow up with me. So our website is actually seattletech4housing.org. It's Seattle Tech, then the number 4housing.org. Our Twitter handle is CTech4Housing, SEA Tech, the letter 4, housing. And we have a Facebook group. If you just Google Tech for Housing or Seattle Tech for Housing on Facebook, you'll find a Facebook group, and there's a lot of discussion there amongst people who kind of care about housing from the tech industry.
Fantastic. I'll make sure to have all those links in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Talk to the Left is 100% independent. I'm just some dude in Seattle with a microphone and way too much spare time. I need your help to reach new listeners. You are probably listening to this on some kind of podcasting app. Almost all of those apps have a way to share a podcast episode on social media. If you think that this episode was important and that more people should hear it, then could you share this episode on Facebook or Twitter? Or maybe you are even listening to this episode on Facebook or Twitter. In that case, sharing this episode is even easier. In this age of algorithmically controlled ads, word of mouth is more important than ever, even if that word of mouth is digital. So please share this episode on social media. Change won't happen without action, and every action counts, no matter how small.